Imagine a wedding ring, not made of simple gold, but one forged in the fires of absolute power and encrusted with the jewels of an entire empire. To wear it was to be the wife of the most powerful man on earth, the Empress of Rome. It is a position that sounds like a fantasy, a dream of unimaginable prestige and influence. But for the women who held this title, the reality was often a waking nightmare. This ring was not a symbol of love, but a gilded handcuff. And behind the marble facade of the imperial palace, a quiet truth was understood by all who lived there. Marriage was not about affection. It was about advantage. Marriage was war. Tonight, we begin our journey with the stories of two women who came to define the lethal nature of this sacred union. One was a master of the slow poison and the patient plot. The other was a creature of such scandalous appetite that her story would become a warning for centuries to come. Welcome to the world of the Roman Empress. Our story begins in a city, breathing a sigh of relief. Rome had just endured decades of brutal civil war. Brother had fought brother, and the Republic had torn itself apart. Now, one man stood victorious above the ashes. Gaius Octavius, soon to be known to all the world as Augustus. He promised peace, order, and a return to traditional values. At the very center of this carefully crafted image of stability stood his wife, Livia Drusilla. To the public, she was the perfect Roman matron, a living embodiment of dignity and domestic virtue. She was rarely seen in extravagant jewels or clothes. Instead, poets and historians described her sitting with her handmaidens, dutifully spinning wool, a symbol of old-fashioned Roman modesty. She was presented as the loyal, unassuming partner to the father of the empire. But beneath this serene surface, darker whispers flowed like the Tiber River through the heart of the city, persistent and deep. These whispers painted a very different picture, one of a ruthless political operator, a woman whose ambition for her own family was boundless, and whose patience was as long and as certain as the passing of a lifetime. The nature of their union was a public spectacle from its very first day. When Augustus, then still called Octavian, first met Livia, she was married to another man, Tiberius Claudius Nero. Not only was she married, but she was already the mother of a young son, and 6 months pregnant with her second. Her husband had been an enemy of Octavian, a supporter of Mark Antony in the recent conflicts. Yet, Octavian was captivated by Livia's grace, her intelligence, and her powerful family connections. He wanted her, and what he wanted, he took. He compelled her husband to divorce her, a humiliating public command that no one could refuse. In the year 38 BC, Livia Drusilla, pregnant with another man's child, became the wife of the future emperor. This was not a romance. It was a political calculation, a clear sign that for the new ruling family of Rome, marriage was a tool of statecraft, as cold and as hard as the marble of their new temples. For years, Augustus ruled, and Livia stood by his side, the very picture of quiet support. The emperor, however, needed a blood heir to secure his new dynasty. Livia had given him no children of his own, and his only child was a daughter, Julia, from a previous marriage. And so, Augustus began to groom his successors from his own bloodline. His first choice was Marcellus, his beloved nephew. A promising young man, he was married to Julia and was being prepared for a great future. But then, in the year 23 BC, tragedy struck. A sudden illness swept through Rome, and the young Marcellus was taken by it. The city mourned, and Augustus was devastated. Yet, as the emperor wept for his lost heir, quiet rumors began to circulate. Some noted that Livia's own son, Tiberius, was the same age as Marcellus. And with Marcellus gone, Tiberius was now one step closer to the throne. The whispers said the boy's fever had not been a product of chance, but of poison. After a period of mourning, Augustus moved again to secure his legacy. He turned to his most trusted friend, the brilliant general Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. The widower Agrippa was married to Augustus's daughter Julia, and together they produced the heirs the emperor so desperately wanted. 2 boys, Gaius and Lucius Caesar. Augustus was overjoyed. He officially adopted his grandsons as his own children, making them the undeniable successors to his throne. He doted on them, personally overseeing their education and showing them off to the Roman people. For Livia, this must have been a difficult time. Her own son Tiberius, a capable military commander, was overshadowed completely. He was made to marry the now twice widowed Julia, a union both of them reportedly despised, simply to act as a temporary guardian for the young heirs. Livia's ambitions for her son seemed to be permanently thwarted. It appeared that the Julian line, not Livia's Claudian blood, would rule Rome for generations to come. But the fate of Rome, it seems, had other plans. As the years passed, and the young princes Gaius and Lucius grew into men, the pattern of convenient tragedy began again. The plan was for them to gain experience in governing the provinces before taking their place in Rome. Lucius was sent on a mission to Spain, but he never reached his destination. Along the way, he fell ill and died suddenly in the year 02 AD. Just 18 months later, his brother Gaius was on campaign in the east in Armenia. After a minor battle, a wound on his arm became infected, and he too succumbed to a sudden illness. In less than 2 years, both of Augustus's beloved adopted sons were gone. The path to power, once hopelessly blocked, was now wide open. There was only one person left who could possibly succeed the aging emperor. It was Livia's son, Tiberius. The official stories spoke of tragic accidents and battlefield wounds, but many in Rome saw the unmistakable shadow of the empress hanging over these events. Decades had passed since her marriage. Livia had played the long game, watching and waiting as every single rival to her son was cleared from the board. First Marcellus, then the sons of Agrippa. Each death was explained away, attributed to illness or misfortune, but the cumulative effect was undeniable. She had outlasted them all. The final piece of the puzzle was her own husband. The historian Cassius Dio, writing nearly 2 centuries later, tells a story that has defined Livia's legacy. He wrote that in his final years, the elderly Augustus had grown suspicious of his wife. He began to take precautions, refusing any food or drink that he had not personally approved. He took to eating figs that he would pick himself, directly from the trees in his garden, trusting only what his own hands had touched. Livia, seeing this, devised a plan of terrifying ingenuity. She found the figs her husband favored, and while they were still on the tree, she painted a few of them with a potent, fast-acting poison. The scene, as the historians imagine it, is one of chilling domestic tranquility. One afternoon, Livia and Augustus were walking together in the garden. She went to the fig tree and plucked the fresh fruit, eating the ones she knew were safe. She then offered one of the poisoned figs, still on its branch, to her husband. It was a casual gesture, a wife sharing a piece of fruit with her aging partner. Suspecting nothing, Augustus took the fig and ate it. Soon after, he fell gravely ill, and in the year 14 AD, the first emperor of Rome, was dead. Tiberius, the son for whom Livia had sacrificed and schemed for so long, was immediately recalled to the city. He stood before the Senate, and with his mother's support, he was proclaimed the new emperor. Livia, now the mother of the emperor, was granted the title of Augusta and continued to wield immense influence from behind the scenes. She had finally won. It is a dramatic, almost unbelievable story. And it is important to remember that it may not be true. The ancient historians who recorded these events were often biased, relying on rumor and innuendo to create a compelling narrative. There is no hard evidence that Livia poisoned anyone, but the story of the poisoned fig persists for a reason. It perfectly captures the reputation she had earned over a lifetime. It represented the ultimate fear of the Roman elite, the danger that lurked not on the battlefield, but within their own homes, in the quiet, intimate moments of daily life. Livia was the archetype of the hidden threat. She was a woman who understood that true power did not always need to be shouted. It could be whispered. It could be patient. It could wait for years, even decades, to achieve its aims with a simple, devastating gesture. Her methods were subtle, patient, and shrouded in plausible deniability. She operated in the shadows of the palace, a quiet and constant presence, weaving her plans over the course of an entire generation. Her story is a testament to one kind of power, the kind that festers and plots, a hidden dagger that waits for the perfect moment to strike. But the world of the Roman empress contained other dangers too. Not every woman had Livia's patience or her talent for subtlety. Our next empress wielded her ambition, not like a hidden blade, but like a battering ram. She sought to satisfy her desires in the most public way imaginable, creating a scandal so brazen and so shocking that it would risk toppling the throne itself and bring the entire imperial court to its knees. She was a force of nature, an explosion of recklessness in a world that demanded careful calculation. The Emperor Claudius was never meant to rule. He was a man who had spent most of his 50 years hidden away, scorned by his own family for his physical infirmities, his limp, and his stammer. He was a scholar, not a statesman, a relic of the past who had somehow survived the deadly purges of his relatives. But when the Emperor Caligula was assassinated, the Praetorian Guard found Claudius hiding behind a curtain, and in a strange twist of fate, they proclaimed him emperor. He was an accidental ruler, and his court was a place of intrigue and uncertainty, managed largely by powerful former slaves known as freedmen. Into this world of precarious power stepped his third wife, a young woman who was his own cousin, Valeria Messalina. She was barely out of her teens, beautiful, and possessed a wild, reckless ambition that would make the careful plotting of Livia seem like a child's game. Messalina became a legend, a name synonymous with moral corruption and insatiable lust. The ancient historians, men like Tacitus and Suetonius, wrote of her with a mixture of fascination and disgust. They claimed that she would disguise herself at night, putting on a wig and simple clothes, to slip out of the palace and work in a common brothel, seeking thrills the imperial bed could not provide. While her aging husband slept, Messalina supposedly explored the darkest corners of Rome's underworld. This reputation was cemented by a single shocking story told by the writer Pliny the Elder. He described a competition, a perverse wager that Messalina made with the most famous prostitute in the city. The goal was to see who could pleasure more men in a single 24-hour period. The contest raged through the night, and in the end, the Empress of Rome emerged victorious. Her reputation was solidified by a particularly shocking tale shared by the writer Pliny the Elder. He recounted a contest, a rather unusual bet that Messalina made with the most renowned figure in the city. The challenge was to see who could charm more admirers in a single 24-hour period. The competition unfolded throughout the night, and in the end, the Empress of Rome emerged as the winner. Whether these stories were literally true, or simply the exaggerated gossip of a disapproving aristocracy, is impossible to know. They may have been slander, a way to attack the emperor by demonizing his wife. But their existence tells us everything we need to know about Messalina's reputation. She did not care for the quiet dignity that Livia had so carefully cultivated. She refused to play the part of the modest Roman matron. Her behavior was a constant public spectacle, a source of endless scandal that undermined the authority of her husband Claudius. She seemed to thrive on the danger, on pushing the boundaries of her position to their absolute limit. Her appetites were not just a private matter. They were an open challenge to the very idea of imperial decorum, and they would have profound and deadly political consequences for those who stood in her way. Her cruelty was as legendary as her lust. Messalina understood that her influence over the easily swayed Claudius was her greatest weapon. With the help of the powerful freedmen who ran the emperor's affairs, she turned the court into her personal hunting ground. Any man who rejected her advances, or any woman who she saw as a rival for beauty or influence, soon found themselves facing trumped-up charges of treason or immorality. Senators, nobles, and even members of the imperial family were not safe. She held the power of life and death, and she wielded it with a terrifying lack of restraint. To cross Messalina was to invite ruin. She would whisper poison into the emperor's ear, and soon his signature would be on an execution order, sending another of her enemies to their grave. Among her many victims were some of the most prominent figures in Rome. Julia Livilla, the sister of the former Emperor Caligula, was exiled on charges of adultery and later starved to death on Messalina's orders. Her true crime likely being her royal blood and proximity to the throne. The great Stoic philosopher Seneca was also banished from Rome, accused of having an affair with the very same Julia Livilla. He would spend 8 years in exile, a punishment orchestrated by the empress, who saw his influence as a threat. These were not random acts of passion. They were cold, calculated moves to eliminate rivals and consolidate her own power. Messalina was building a base of loyalists, enriching herself and her allies with the confiscated properties of the men and women she destroyed. She was a whirlwind of greed and ambition, tearing through the Roman elite with terrifying speed. But amidst all these passing affairs and political schemes, one obsession rose above the rest. It was her passion for a man named Gaius Silius. He was a senator, an intelligent and ambitious aristocrat who was widely considered to be the most handsome man in all of Rome. Their affair was an open secret, a topic of gossip in every wealthy home in the city. Messalina showered him with gifts and political favors, elevating him to the highest ranks of power. She would visit his home openly, accompanied by her vast entourage, completely disregarding any pretense of secrecy. But for Messalina, this was not enough. The affair grew into a consuming passion that seemed to drive her towards an act of ultimate self-destruction. She was no longer content to simply have Silius as her lover. She needed to possess him entirely. The affair soon crossed a line from which there could be no return. Gaius Silius was a married man, his wife a respected noblewoman named Junia Silana. For Messalina, This was an intolerable obstacle. In a staggering display of her power over him, she demanded that Silius divorce his wife. He was a man with his own ambitions, and he knew that to refuse the empress was death, but to obey her was to step into a conspiracy that could only end in ruin. He hesitated, caught in an impossible position. But Messalina's influence, and perhaps his own ambition, won out. He divorced his innocent wife, casting her aside to satisfy the desires of the empress. Their affair was no longer just an indulgence. By destroying another noble marriage, Messalina was now openly attacking the very fabric of the Roman aristocracy. This affair, however, would not remain a simple matter of personal scandal. It began to spiral into something far more dangerous. The bond between Messalina and Silius deepened into a public partnership, a flagrant rejection of the emperor himself. They were no longer just lovers. They began to act like a ruling couple. Silius started adopting the children of the imperial household, and Messalina transferred priceless imperial heirlooms from the palace to his private home. They were creating a new court, centered around themselves. This was no longer just adultery. This was treason. The affair with Gaius Silius would not stay in the shadows. It would escalate into an act of such audacious rebellion that it would seal her fate forever and force the hand of the faltering emperor. The final, unbelievable act took place in the autumn of the year 48 AD. The Emperor Claudius had traveled to Ostia, the port city of Rome, to inspect the progress of a new harbor he was building. He was away from the capital for several days, leaving the administration of the city in the hands of his officials and his wife. For Messalina, this was the moment she had been waiting for. With the emperor gone, she decided to take the ultimate gamble. She and Gaius Silius were not just going to continue their affair, they were going to get married. It was an act of formal bigamy, a direct and public repudiation of her marriage to Claudius. It was a move so insane, so far beyond the bounds of Roman law and tradition, that it almost defied belief. While the emperor was busy with matters of state, his wife threw a wedding party. But this was no secret ceremony. Tacitus describes a full-blown festival, a wild and drunken celebration of her new union. The finest wine flowed freely. The guests, a mixture of her closest allies and reckless thrill-seekers, celebrated with wild abandon. A formal marriage contract was drawn up and signed in front of official witnesses, making the union legally binding in their eyes. The Empress of the Roman Empire had publicly and formally married her lover while her husband was still alive and ruling. This was not just a personal betrayal. It was a political coup, an announcement to the world that she and Silius were now the true power in Rome. The news of this outrageous ceremony would soon begin its journey down the road from Rome to the port of Ostia, straight to the ears of the emperor she had just betrayed. The news traveled fast. In the emperor's camp at Ostia, it was not Claudius who first understood the danger, but his powerful inner circle of freedmen. These men, led by the calculating Narcissus, had risen from slavery to become the most influential administrators in the empire. They had long been Messalina's allies in her schemes, helping her eliminate her enemies and enriching themselves in the process. But they knew her character. They knew that a new husband, Gaius Silius, would mean a new inner circle. A successful coup by Messalina and Silius would mean their own execution. Their survival now depended on destroying the very woman they had helped empower. The bond of conspiracy had been broken, replaced by the cold logic of self-preservation. Narcissus knew he had to act first, and he had to act decisively. He did not wait for an invitation. He burst into the emperor's private chambers, his face a mask of panic and urgency. He found Claudius confused, uncertain of what was happening in Rome. Narcissus laid out the story in the most terrifying terms possible. This was not just a wedding, he explained. It was a plot to overthrow the government. Silius was the new emperor, and his legions were already marching to Ostia to assassinate Claudius. He painted a picture of imminent betrayal and mortal danger, exaggerating every detail to shock the indecisive emperor out of his stupor. Claudius was terrified, paralyzed by the news. The ancient historians tell us that he repeatedly asked his officials a single pathetic question. Am I still the emperor? He seemed incapable of comprehending the betrayal, let alone acting against it. He was a man lost in a storm, unable to find his own way to safety. Seeing his master frozen with fear, Narcissus seized command of the situation himself. Without waiting for a clear order from the emperor, he spoke with the authority of the throne. He summoned the commander of the Praetorian Guard and declared Messalina and Silius to be enemies of the state. He ordered the guards to march on Rome immediately, to arrest everyone involved in the wedding feast, and to secure the city. It was a moment of incredible risk. Narcissus was acting beyond his official power, but he knew it was the only way. He placed himself at the head of the Praetorian cohorts and began the journey back to Rome with the terrified emperor in tow. The hunt was on. The plot that Messalina had so brazenly orchestrated was now unraveling with terrifying speed. The power she had taken for granted was about to be turned against her. Back in Rome, the drunken wedding celebrations came to an abrupt and brutal end. Soldiers burst in, arresting the shocked guests. Panic replaced the joyous revelry. Gaius Silius, the handsome groom who had dreamed of becoming emperor, was dragged before the authorities. He made no attempt to defend himself. He knew the game was over, and his only request was for a quick death. It was granted. Others from the party were executed without trial. The net was closing, and at its center was the empress herself. As the news of the crackdown spread, Messalina fled. She found refuge in a place that was a monument to her own greed, the gardens of Lucullus. These were among the most beautiful and opulent pleasure gardens in the city, which she had forced its previous owner to sell to her. Now this symbol of her power became her last sanctuary. She waited in the gardens, her imperial entourage having melted away into the shadows. The senators and knights who had toasted her marriage just hours before were now nowhere to be found. In her moment of greatest need, Messalina was almost completely alone. It was here, amidst the statues and fountains, that she was joined by an unexpected figure, her mother, Domitia Lepida. The two had been estranged for years, as Messalina had shown her mother little respect during her ascent to power. But now, seeing her daughter's complete ruin, Lepida took pity on her. She did not offer false hope or comfort. Instead, she offered the last, grim piece of advice available to a disgraced Roman noble. She told Messalina that her life was over. The only thing left to control was the manner of her death. She urged her daughter to take her own life, to find a noble end rather than suffer the humiliation of public execution at the hands of a common soldier. Her mother's words were a stark recognition of reality. The life of scandal and power had come to this, a choice between a quick death by her own hand or a brutal one by another's. Her mother placed a dagger in her hand. But Messalina, the woman who had sent so many others to their deaths, without a second thought, could not find the courage to end her own life. She wept, she hesitated, her nerve failing her completely. Her hand trembled as she tried to press the blade to her throat, but she could not do it. Her final moments were not a display of stoic Roman virtue, but of desperate human fear. While she hesitated, the gates to the garden burst open. The soldiers, led by a stern tribune sent by Narcissus, had found her. They saw the empress, disheveled and weeping, her mother standing beside her. The tribune did not waste time with words. He shouted his orders, and his men advanced. Messalina's mother turned away, unable to watch the final bloody act. The tribune drew his sword, and without hesitation ran the empress through. Her life of reckless ambition and brazen scandal ended there, on the cold ground of the gardens she had stolen. The empress was dead, just 26 years old. Back in Ostia, when the news of his wife's execution was brought to Claudius, he was seated at a banquet. The historian Tacitus reports that he showed no emotion at all. No sadness, no anger, no relief. He did not even speak of it. He simply requested another cup of wine and continued with his meal, as if nothing of consequence had happened. The great, destructive passion of his life was extinguished, and he met the news with a chilling, empty silence. In the days that followed, the Roman Senate, ever eager to please the emperor, moved to formalize her destruction. They decreed a damnatio memoria, the damnation of memory. It was one of the most severe punishments the state could inflict. Messalina's name was to be chiseled off every public inscription in the empire. Every statue bearing her likeness was to be torn down and destroyed. The goal was not just to kill her, but to erase her, to pretend as if she had never existed at all. The Senate hoped to cleanse the stain of her scandal from the pages of history. But in this, they failed. Her story was too shocking, too dramatic to be forgotten. She became a permanent fixture in the Roman imagination, a ghost in the marble halls, a timeless warning of ambition without limits. For those of you still with me, we have just witnessed the spectacular fall of an empress. Let the sounds of ancient Rome settle around you, as the story of this gilded cage is only just beginning. Livia's quiet, patient poison and Messalina's brazen, self-destructive rebellion represent the two extremes of the imperial experience. One was a slow, creeping threat that took decades to unfold. The other was a sudden, violent explosion that shook the foundations of the state. Messalina's gruesome fate was a bloody message sent to all future empresses and to the powerful families of Rome. A wedding to an emperor was not a promise of security, but an entry into a political battlefield with the highest possible stakes. Life in the palace was a constant, deadly gamble. In our next part, we will step back from these shocking stories to understand the system itself, the cold, hard rules of marriage as a political weapon, a system that created the conditions for such brutal tragedies to unfold. To understand the tragedies of women like Livia and Messalina, we must look beyond the palace walls and back into the past. The ruthless system in which they lived was not invented by the emperors. It was forged in the dying fires of the Roman Republic. For 100 years before the first emperor, Rome was a chaotic arena of ambition, a place where powerful men, known as warlords, competed for ultimate control. In this high-stakes game, armies and wealth were essential, but the most crucial weapon of all was often the quietest. It was the sacred institution of marriage. A daughter's wedding vow could forge an alliance more powerful than any legion, and the breaking of that vow, through death or divorce, could shatter the peace of the entire world. The emperors would later codify this system, but it was the titans of the Republic who first wrote its rules in blood. The story of this system truly begins with three men who decided to carve up the Roman world among themselves. They were Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, a celebrated general; Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome; and the endlessly ambitious Julius Caesar. They were rivals, each a giant in his own right, each wary of the others. In the year 60 BC, they formed a secret pact, an informal alliance that history would call the First Triumvirate. It was a private agreement to dominate the state, to bypass the Senate, and to pool their immense resources for their own benefit. This alliance, however, was built on a foundation of pure self-interest and mutual suspicion. It needed something more to hold it together, a human bond to seal the dangerous political contract. And Julius Caesar had the perfect solution. The key to cementing this fragile alliance was Caesar's only legitimate child, his beloved daughter Julia. In 59 BC, Caesar made a shocking proposal. He offered his daughter's hand in marriage to his chief rival, Pompey. At the time, Julia was a young woman, perhaps in her late teens, while Pompey was a man in his mid-40s, already a legend. The age gap was significant, and the political nature of the match was insultingly obvious to all of Rome. It was a purely transactional move, designed to tie Pompey's ambition directly to Caesar's own. By making Pompey his son-in-law, Caesar created a personal link that made it much harder for their rivalry to tear the triumvirate apart. Pompey accepted, and the wedding took place. The union of a powerful general and a wealthy politician was now sealed by the vows of a young woman. This marriage was a textbook example of a political tool. It was a public declaration that these two powerful men were now family, and that an attack on one was an attack on the other. But something unexpected happened. Despite the cold political calculations that brought them together, by all accounts, Pompey and Julia developed a deep and genuine affection for one another. The ancient sources, which are so often filled with scandal and cynicism, speak of Pompey's surprising devotion to his young wife. He was said to be so captivated by her company that he began to neglect his public duties, preferring to spend his time with her at their country estates rather than engaging in the politics of the capital. The political alliance, it seemed, had accidentally blossomed into a loving partnership. For a few brief years, this personal bond brought a strange kind of stability to the turbulent world of Roman politics. But this stability was as fragile as life itself. In the year 54 BC, the personal glue that held the triumvirate together dissolved in tragedy. Julia became pregnant, an event that should have strengthened the bond between Caesar and Pompey even further, promising a new generation with the blood of both men. But she went into a difficult labor and died in childbirth. A few days later, her infant daughter also died, extinguishing the last physical link between the two great rivals. Caesar, who was on campaign in Britain, was said to be devastated by the loss of his only child. Pompey, too, was overcome with grief for the wife he had come to adore. The Roman people mourned with them, recognizing that something more than just a woman had been lost. A symbol of peace and unity was gone, and the future of Rome was once again uncertain. The political consequences of Julia's death were not immediate, but they were profound and inescapable. The alliance between Caesar and Pompey had been built on three pillars: Pompey's military prestige, Crassus's wealth, and the marriage that bound the two men together. Just a year after Julia's death, The second pillar crumbled when Crassus was killed in a disastrous campaign in the east. Now, only two titans remained, and the personal tie that had tempered their rivalry was gone. Old suspicions began to resurface. Pompey remained in Rome, growing closer to the conservative faction of the Senate, who had always feared Caesar's ambition. Caesar, meanwhile, was gaining unprecedented power and loyalty from his long and successful campaigns in Gaul. Without Julia as a bridge between them, the two men began to drift apart, their alliance giving way to the cold gravity of their competing ambitions. The personal tragedy of one family soon became the tragedy of the entire Roman world. The Senate, seeing Pompey as the lesser of two evils, began to pass laws aimed at stripping Caesar of his command and his armies. They backed Pompey, making him their champion against the man they saw as a potential king. The political maneuvering escalated until compromise was no longer possible. In 49 BC, just 5 years after Julia's death, the Senate demanded that Caesar lay down his arms. He refused. Leading his veteran legions, he famously crossed the Rubicon River, the legal boundary of his province, and marched on Rome. This act ignited a devastating civil war that would rage across the Mediterranean. From Italy to Egypt, the final contest between Caesar and Pompey, a war that Julia's life had prevented, now consumed the Republic. Her death was not just a footnote in history. It was the catalyst that led directly to the end of an era. This system of political marriage was the dominant reality for the Roman elite. But it is important to remember that it was not the only reality. There were rare moments when personal loyalty defied political calculation, and the most famous example also involves Julius Caesar himself. Years earlier, when Caesar was a young man just starting his career, Rome was under the control of a brutal dictator named Lucius Cornelius. Sulla was purging his political enemies, and the young Caesar, whose family had opposed him, was on the list. Sulla offered him a way out. He commanded Caesar to divorce his wife, Cornelia. A simple act of obedience would have saved his career and likely his life. But Caesar, in a stunning act of defiance that would become central to his legend, refused. This refusal was an incredibly dangerous decision. For his loyalty to his wife, Caesar was stripped of his inheritance and his position as a priest. A death sentence was issued, and he was forced to flee Rome and go into hiding, moving from house to house in the dead of night to avoid Sulla's assassins. He fell ill with a fever and was nearly captured, only saving himself by bribing the soldiers who found him. Eventually, his powerful relatives were able to persuade the dictator to grant him a pardon. Sulla reluctantly agreed, but he was said to have warned them that in this young man who defied him for a woman, he saw many Mariuses, a reference to his greatest rival. Caesar's loyalty to Cornelia had cost him everything, but it had also defined him as a man of formidable will, someone who would not bow to pressure, even from a dictator. These two stories from Caesar's life reveal the profound paradox of marriage in the Roman world. On the one hand, his daughter Julia's marriage to Pompey was a perfect example of the system at its most strategic. She was a pawn in a great game, and her death had catastrophic consequences for the state. On the other hand, Caesar's own refusal to abandon his wife Cornelia showed that genuine attachment and personal honor could, at great risk, override political necessity. These were the precedents, the dramatic successes and failures that the next generation would study with great care. The fall of the Republic demonstrated with bloody clarity the immense power and the terrifying fragility of alliances built on marriage. The man who would rise from the ashes of that civil war, Caesar's adopted son Octavian, understood this lesson intimately. He would not just use marriage as a tool. He would build the very architecture of his new empire upon it, creating a system more rigid and more ruthless than ever before. In the Roman world, ending a marriage was alarmingly simple. There were no courts to petition, no judges to persuade. A marriage began with the consent of the couple, and it ended the moment that consent was withdrawn. All it took was a simple, private declaration. A man could dismiss his wife by simply saying, "Take your things and go," and the union was legally dissolved. For an ordinary woman, this was a precarious existence. For the wife of an emperor, it was a source of constant, terrifying insecurity. Her husband was not just a man. He was the state, and his personal whims could change with the political winds. A woman could be the empress of Rome one day and a discarded exile the next, her fate sealed by a quiet word spoken in a private room of the palace. The most tragic victim of this system was the woman, who was meant to be its greatest symbol. Augustus's own daughter, Julia. We left her trapped in a miserable, loveless marriage with Tiberius, her spirit seemingly broken. But it was not. Forced into a union she despised, Julia began to rebel in the only way she could. She engaged in a series of scandalous affairs, her behavior growing more and more public, more and more reckless. She was said to hold drunken parties in the Romão, Forum itself, the very heart of the city, openly mocking her father's strict morality laws. It was an act of profound defiance, a desperate attempt to find freedom and happiness in a life that had been so cruelly controlled. Her rebellion, however, would bring down the full, unforgiving weight of her father's power. When Augustus learned the extent of his daughter's activities, his reaction was one of theatrical fury. She had not only disobeyed him as a father, but she had publicly shamed him as an emperor, making a mockery of the very laws he had passed to define his reign. He sent a letter to the Senate, publicly denouncing his own child in the most humiliating terms, listing her alleged lovers and her scandalous behavior. The punishment he chose was not a quiet divorce, but a public and permanent banishment. Julia, the daughter of the emperor, was arrested and charged with adultery, which under her father's own law was now a criminal offense. Her life of gilded misery was about to be replaced by one of open and desolate imprisonment. Her place of exile was a tiny, windswept island in the Tyrrhenian Sea called Panditeria. It was a barren rock, less than 2 square miles in size, with no men and no comforts. She was forbidden from drinking wine and cut off from all visitors, except for those personally approved by her father. The woman who had once been the center of Roman society was now condemned to a life of utter isolation. Augustus never forgave her. He refused all pleas for her pardon, both from the Roman people and from Tiberius himself. When someone mentioned Julia in his presence, he was known to quote the Greek hero Bellerophon, saying, "Would that I were unmarried, or had died without a child." For Augustus, her betrayal was absolute, and her punishment would be equally so. But many historians, both ancient and modern, have suspected that Julia's crime was far more serious than adultery. Her alleged lovers were not random men, but a group of well-connected young aristocrats, the sons of powerful families. The theory is that their gatherings were not just drunken parties, but the meetings of a political faction, a group that was dissatisfied with Augustus's increasingly autocratic rule and his choice of the grim Tiberius as his successor. Julia may have been the figurehead of a conspiracy to change the future of the empire. If this is true, her exile was not the act of a heartbroken father. It was a ruthless political purge, a move by the emperor to eliminate a threat to his regime. Julia was not just a disobedient daughter. She was a political rival, and she was disposed of accordingly. The tragedy of Julia also created other victims, collateral damage in the emperor's grand dynastic game. Before he was forced to marry Julia, Tiberius had been married to a woman named Vipsania Agrippina. By all accounts, it was that rarest of things in the Roman elite, a happy and loving marriage. Tiberius was devoted to Vipsania, and she had just given him a son, but their happiness was irrelevant to Augustus. He needed Tiberius to marry Julia to secure the succession, and so he ordered them to divorce. Tiberius, despite his high rank, was powerless to refuse the command of the emperor. He obeyed, sacrificing his personal happiness for the good of the state. The heartbreak of this separation would haunt him for the rest of his life. The historian Suetonius tells a poignant story that reveals the depth of Tiberius's grief. Sometime after the divorce, he happened to catch a glimpse of Vipsania in the street. He immediately began to follow her, his eyes filled with tears, his face a picture of silent anguish. His attendants had to rush to his side and lead him away. After this public display of emotion, careful arrangements were made to ensure that he would never accidentally see his first wife again. Even decades later, as a grim and bitter emperor himself, the memory of Vipsania was a source of profound sadness. Her life and Tiberius's own chance at happiness were simply ground up in the gears of the great imperial machine that Augustus had built. Not every discarded wife, however, ended in tragedy or exile. Some, through their dignity and conduct, could be transformed into powerful symbols for the state. This was the fate of Augustus's own sister, Octavia the Younger. In the chaotic years after Caesar's death, Octavia was married to Mark Antony, a move designed to seal the alliance between her brother and his most powerful rival. Octavia, known for her loyalty and grace, dutifully went to live with her new husband. But Antony was soon captivated by another woman, Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. He began a famous and all-consuming affair with her, effectively abandoning his Roman wife. In 32 BC, he officially divorced Octavia, a public and deeply personal insult to her and to Augustus. This betrayal could have been a moment of weakness for Augustus, a sign of his family's humiliation. But he, and Octavia herself, turned it into a source of immense strength. While Antony lived a life of supposed decadence and luxury with his foreign queen in Egypt, Octavia remained in Rome, the very model of Roman virtue. She never spoke ill of her former husband. She continued to live in his house, and she devoted herself to raising not only her own children by Antony, but also his children from his previous relationships. Her quiet dignity, her loyalty, and her maternal devotion were held up as the perfect example of a Roman matron's character. She became a living propaganda weapon for her brother. Augustus masterfully contrasted his sister's noble suffering with the character of Cleopatra, whom he portrayed as a dangerous, decadent, and corrupting foreign influence. The coming war was framed not as a Roman civil war, which it was, but as a defense of Roman values against an Eastern threat. Octavia was the symbol of everything that was good and pure about Rome, while Cleopatra represented everything that was foreign and dangerous. The personal humiliation of his sister was thus transformed into a powerful public justification for war. Octavia's story shows the third possible fate of an imperial woman in this system. If she was no longer useful as a wife, she could be discarded as an exile like Julia, remembered as a tragic sacrifice like Vipsania, or repurposed as a political symbol, her personal life becoming fuel for the engine of the state. The calculated system of political marriage, divorce, and exile created a unique and terrifying existence for the woman who wore the title of empress. Her life was lived on a knife's edge, a constant state of performance where her value was always being assessed. She was a mother, a wife, a symbol, and a pawn, all at once. Her security was an illusion, dependent on her fertility, her political usefulness, and the whims of the most powerful man on earth. We have seen how the system was built, from its roots in the Republic to its perfection under Augustus. Now, in our next part, we will step inside the palace walls, past the public laws and grand strategies, to understand the constant, daily perils the Empress was forced to navigate. Life inside the imperial palace was a world unto itself. It was a place of immense luxury and profound isolation, a gilded cage where every word was weighed and every hallway could hide a threat. We have seen the grand political system that dictated the marriages and divorces of the imperial women. But to truly understand their lives, we must now step across the threshold into the daily reality of their existence. Here, the greatest pressure was not always an external political plot, but an internal, biological imperative. For an empress, her entire worth, her security, and her very survival often depended on one single, all-important function: her ability to produce a male heir. This was the weight of the womb, a constant, grinding pressure that could make or break her life. The Roman Empire, for all its laws and legions, had a fatal flaw at its very center. There was no formal legal process for succession. It was not a monarchy with clear rules of inheritance. Power did not automatically pass from father to son. The only thing that truly mattered was a combination of military support, Senate approval, and most importantly, blood. A biological son of the emperor had the strongest claim, the one most likely to be accepted by the soldiers and the people, ensuring a peaceful transition of power. Without a clear heir, the empire risked plunging back into the bloody civil wars that Augustus had fought so hard to end. Therefore, the empress's primary role, above all else, was to be the vessel for that succession. Her body was not her own. It was an asset of the state, and her fertility was a matter of national security. Failure to produce an heir was a political death sentence. A barren empress was seen as having failed in her most fundamental duty, making her vulnerable and disposable. The tragic story of Claudia Octavia serves as the starkest example. She was the daughter of the Emperor Claudius and the first wife of his successor, Nero. On paper, she was the perfect imperial bride, a living link between the old, regime, and the new. But her marriage to Nero was unhappy, and she remained childless. This failure became the weapon that her rival, the beautiful and ambitious Poppaea Sabina, used against her. Poppaea, who was Nero's mistress, wanted to be empress herself, and Octavia's infertility gave her the opening she needed. Poppaea played on Nero's frustration and ambition. She convinced him that his marriage to Octavia was a political dead end. He needed a son to secure his legacy, something his barren wife could not provide. Nero, infatuated with Poppaea, listened. He divorced Claudia Octavia, citing her inability to conceive. But divorce was not enough to neutralize her. As the beloved daughter of the deified Claudius, she remained a popular figure and a potential rallying point for Nero's enemies. To eliminate her completely, Poppaea and her allies concocted false charges of adultery against Octavia. She was exiled to the island of Pandateria, the same desolate rock where Julia had been imprisoned. There, in the year 62 A.D., the terrified young woman was bound and her veins were opened. Her sad life is a clear testament to the brutal logic of the system. An empress without a child was a liability waiting to be removed. Yet, if failing to produce an heir was dangerous, succeeding could be even more so. A son could secure an empress's position, but it also plunged her into a new and more perilous political game. It made her and her child a target for every other ambitious member of the court. No one understood this better than Agrippina the Younger, the sister of Caligula and the mother of Nero. She was one of the most formidable women in Roman history, a direct descendant of Augustus himself, and she possessed a ruthless ambition that rivaled any emperor's. She had what every empress craved: a healthy, intelligent son who had a plausible claim to the throne. Her entire life became a masterclass in promoting that son, a journey that shows how success in childbirth was only the first step in a long and deadly struggle. Her great gamble began when she married her own uncle, the Emperor Claudius. The union was controversial, requiring a special act of the Senate to legalize the incestuous match. But for Agrippina, it was a necessary move. It brought her back to the absolute center of power and made her the empress. From this position, she immediately began maneuvering to advance her son, Nero. Claudius already had a son of his own, a boy named Britannicus, who should have been the natural heir. But Agrippina's influence over her aging husband was immense. She flattered him, she manipulated him, and she systematically isolated his son from positions of influence. Her greatest triumph came when she persuaded Claudius to officially adopt Nero, making him the joint heir alongside Britannicus. With Nero now formally recognized and married to Claudia Octavia, his position was almost secure. There was just one obstacle remaining: Claudius himself. As long as the old emperor lived, Britannicus was still a threat. In the year 54 A.D., that final obstacle was removed. The historian Tacitus reports that Agrippina served her husband his favorite dish, a plate of mushrooms. This particular plate, however, had been seasoned with a deadly poison. Claudius fell ill and died within hours. Agrippina, it was said, had secured the throne for her son by murdering her husband. Her plan had worked perfectly. Her son, just 16 years old, was now the emperor of Rome. She had succeeded where so many other women had failed. But this success was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new war. Agrippina had made her son emperor, but she had no intention of retiring into the background. She expected to be the true power behind the throne, ruling the empire through her young, inexperienced son. Nero, however, fueled by his own growing ego and the advice of his tutors, had no desire to be his mother's puppet. The very success that Agrippina had engineered, placing her son in a position of absolute power, now became her greatest danger. It led directly to a bitter 5-year power struggle between mother and son, a battle of wills that would only end when Nero, driven to paranoia, decided that the only way to be truly free was to murder the woman who had given him everything. The dangers of a successful birth were most brutally illustrated in the fate of Milonia Caesonia, the fourth and final wife of the Emperor Caligula. Unlike the wives of other emperors, Caesonia was not chosen for her dynastic connections. Caligula, known for his madness and cruelty, chose her for love, or at least for his own strange version of it. She was neither young nor beautiful, but she devoted herself to the unstable emperor, and she gave him what he desired, a child. Not long after their marriage, she gave birth to a daughter named Julia Drusilla in honor of Caligula's beloved, deceased sister. Caligula was said to be overjoyed. He would carry the infant around, showing her off to the temples of the gods, proclaiming her as his own divine offspring. This child, however, did not secure Caesonia's life. It tied her fate, and that of her daughter, directly to the volatile reign of the mad emperor. Caligula's tyranny and erratic behavior made him countless enemies. In January of the year 41 AD, a conspiracy of Praetorian Guard officers finally struck. They ambushed the emperor in his secluded palace corridor and stabbed him to death. But the assassins knew their work was not finished. An emperor could be replaced, but his heir could grow up to seek revenge. A living child of Caligula would be a perpetual threat, a potential figurehead for any future uprising. To secure their own lives, they had to extinguish the entire imperial line. After killing Caligula, the assassins went in search of his family. They found Caesonia in her chambers, weeping over her husband's body, clutching her infant daughter in her arms. She knew what was coming. Showing a courage she may not have known she possessed, she reportedly bared her neck to the assassins, telling them to strike without hesitation. They did. A centurion ran her through with his sword, but their work was still not done. There was the matter of the child, the infant Julia Drusilla. In a final, horrifying act of pragmatic brutality, one of the assassins seized the baby by her feet, swung her through the air, and smashed her head against a stone wall. The danger did not end with childbirth. In fact, it often began there. As the mother of the heir or the wife of the emperor, the empress was a living symbol of the ruling power and a prime target for those who wished to seize it. The imperial palace was the heart of the Roman world, but it was also a serpent's nest. It was a place of whispers and shadows, where ambition festered and loyalty was a temporary commodity. The empress lived at the absolute center of this web of intrigue. She was surrounded by senators hungry for power, by jealous relatives of the imperial family, and by scheming officials who would do anything to gain the emperor's favor. As the ultimate insider, she was privy to the secrets, the plots, and the shifting alliances of the court. This knowledge was a source of power, but it was also a source of immense danger. To know of a conspiracy was to be a threat to it. And as the person closest to the emperor, the empress was often the first person a rival sought to control, corrupt, or eliminate. No story illustrates this lethal dynamic more clearly than the final, horrifying power struggle between Agrippina the Younger and her son, the Emperor Nero. After she had successfully poisoned Claudius and placed Nero on the throne, Agrippina expected to rule. But Nero, encouraged by his advisors, began to push her away, stripping her of her honors and her bodyguard. Agrippina fought back, threatening to support Claudius's true son, Britannicus, as the rightful emperor. Nero responded by having the young Britannicus poisoned at a dinner party. With his last rival gone, Nero turned his attention to the woman he now saw as his greatest enemy, his own mother. He became consumed by a paranoid fear that as long as she was alive, his throne would never be secure. His first attempt to murder her was a plan of incredible and theatrical cruelty. In the year 59 AD, he invited her to a holiday retreat at the Bay of Naples, pretending that he wanted to reconcile. He treated her with honors, seated her at a lavish banquet, and spoke to her with warmth and affection. When it was time for her to return to her own villa, he led her to a specially constructed ship. The vessel had been designed by one of his freedmen. Its canopy was weighted with lead, and the entire structure was engineered to collapse and sink once it was out on the open water. Nero's plan was to have his mother crushed or drowned, a death that could be plausibly blamed on a tragic accident at sea. He kissed her goodbye and watched as the ship sailed out into the calm moonlit night, but the plan failed. Out on the water, the mechanism was triggered and the canopy fell, but the wooden partitions of Agrippina's couch were strong enough to protect her from being crushed. The ship did not sink immediately, giving the passengers time to react. In the confusion, one of Agrippina's attendants, thinking quickly, cried out that she was the empress in the hopes of being rescued. The sailors, who were in on the plot, promptly beat her to death with their oars. Agrippina herself, however, remained silent. She had suffered a minor shoulder injury, but she was a strong swimmer. She slipped quietly into the dark water and swam until she was picked up by a small fishing boat. She knew, with chilling certainty, that her son had just tried to murder her. The war between them was now out in the open. When news reached Nero that his mother had survived, he flew into a panic. His attempt at a clever, deniable assassination had failed. She now knew his intentions, and he was sure she would try to turn the army and the people against him. His advisors convinced him that he had no choice but to finish the job quickly and decisively. He declared Agrippina an enemy of the state, accusing her of plotting to kill him. He then dispatched a group of assassins to her villa with clear instructions. The pretense of an accident was gone. This was to be an execution. The soldiers surrounded the house, broke down the doors, and stormed into her bedchamber. Agrippina faced them with a final defiant act of courage. She saw the centurion raise his sword, and she knew her life was over. According to the historian Tacitus, she looked her killer in the eye and pointed to her own abdomen. "Strike my womb," she commanded. It was a moment of supreme and bitter irony. She was ordering her assassin to strike the part of her body that had given birth to her own murderer. The soldier obeyed. She was stabbed repeatedly and left for dead. With this act of matricide, Nero had finally freed himself from his mother's influence. He had won their desperate struggle for power, but the crime would haunt him for the rest of his reign, a dark stain on his character that could never be washed away. Not every empress, however, engaged in such brutal, head-on confrontations. Some learned to navigate the serpent's nest with cunning and quiet grace. The most successful example was Plotina, the wife of the Emperor Trajan, who ruled at the turn of the 2nd century. Theirs was a partnership built on mutual respect and Stoic principles. Plotina was a master of soft power, wielding immense influence not through threats or overt commands, but through her reputation for integrity and her wise counsel. She was her husband's most trusted advisor, a respected presence at court who helped shape the policies of one of Rome's most successful reigns. Her greatest test, however, came not during her husband's life, but at the moment of his death. In the year 117 AD, Trajan fell gravely ill while on campaign in the East. He died before he could officially name his successor. This was a moment of extreme danger for the empire. Trajan's preferred heir was his ward and distant relative, the general Hadrian, but the adoption had never been formally completed. Without a clear and legal successor, the powerful generals of the army might have turned on each other, plunging the empire into another civil war. It was Plotina who stepped into this crisis. The official story was that Trajan had signed the adoption papers on his deathbed, but a powerful rumor, one that many historians believe, tells a different story. It suggests that Trajan had already died, and that Plotina concealed his death from the public for several days. In this version of events, Plotina, a woman, imitated the emperor's weak voice from behind a curtain, dictating the final orders and formally adopting Hadrian in Trajan's name. She forged the documents and sent them to the Senate before announcing her husband's death. By the time the world knew Trajan was gone, his successor was already legally in place. Whether this dramatic story is true or not, it reflects her reputation. She was seen as a brilliant political operator, a woman who used her cunning not for personal gain, but for the stability of the empire. She had navigated the ultimate moment of crisis, preventing a war through her quick thinking and a well-timed deception. The dangers of a succession crisis were most vividly displayed during the chaotic period known as the Year of the Four Emperors. In 69 AD, after Nero's suicide left a power vacuum, the Roman world was torn apart by a series of military coups. In the space of a single year, 4 different generals were hailed as emperor, each one rising to power by defeating his predecessor. On the battlefield, for the wives of these men, life became a terrifying gamble. Their status as empress and their very survival depended entirely on the fortunes of war. An empress in the morning could be a widow or a victim. By nightfall, this was the world of women like Galleria Fundata, the wife of the Emperor Vitellius. Her husband was the third of the 4 emperors, a man who ruled for only 8 brief, bloody months. During his short reign, Galleria was the empress, living with the constant threat of the approaching armies of her husband's rival, Vespasian. When Vespasian's forces finally took Rome, Vitellius was captured, brutally tortured, and murdered, his body thrown into the Tiber River. His wife and children were, for a moment, in mortal peril. Galleria was only spared because her father was a powerful man who had no connection to her husband's regime. Her fate illustrates the ultimate precariousness of her position. In times of chaos, an empress's life was tied directly to her husband's reign, and that reign could be as brief and as violent as a single swing of a sword. Yet, even for an empress who successfully navigated the threats of poison and rebellion, her life was far from her own. The constant, high-stakes struggle for survival was only one of the pressures she faced. Even in times of peace, under a stable emperor, her existence was one of profound limitation and suffocating scrutiny. A palace itself was a prison, its walls gilded, but its rules absolute. Her every move was watched, her every word recorded. The danger was not always a dagger in the dark. Sometimes the danger was the slow, grinding pressure of a life that was never truly her own. To survive the vipers of the court and the brutal pressures of succession was a remarkable achievement. But for the empress who managed it, the prize was not freedom. It was a life sentence in a gilded prison. The imperial palace on the Palatine Hill was a world of unimaginable wealth and beauty, filled with fine art, exotic foods, and armies of servants. But these luxuries were the bars of a cage. The empress lived under a level of public scrutiny that is difficult to imagine. Her life was a constant performance, her every word and gesture analyzed for its political significance. She was a symbol, and a symbol has no private life. This was perhaps the most draining peril of all, the slow, relentless erosion of the foe. Self under the crushing weight of the public gaze. Every empress was forced to walk a narrow tightrope, balancing the public ideal of a Roman woman with the political reality of her position. The ideal, promoted heavily in imperial propaganda, was the traditional Roman matron. She was meant to be modest, dignified, and devoted to her home and family. The perfect example of this performance was Livia Drusilla. The image she presented to the world was one of sober domesticity. Poets wrote of her simplicity, and she was often depicted sitting with her handmaidens, spinning wool by hand, just as the virtuous wives of the old republic were said to have done. This was a powerful piece of political theater, presenting the first family as the restorers of old-fashioned Roman values. It was an image of quiet, unassuming loyalty to her great husband. But as we know, this was only a carefully constructed facade. Behind the image of the humble wool spinner was one of the most cunning and influential political minds in the empire. Livia's quiet domesticity was a camouflage, a socially acceptable mask that hid the reality of her power. She understood that in Rome's patriarchal society, a woman could not be seen to wield power openly. It had to be done from the shadows, through quiet suggestion, patient maneuvering, and personal influence over her husband. This was the fundamental paradox of being an empress. She was expected to be powerless in public, while often being incredibly powerful in private. Successfully navigating this contradiction was essential. To be too overt with her ambition could lead to ruin, but to be truly powerless was to become a disposable pawn. This life of constant performance was matched by severe restrictions on personal freedom. An empress could not simply decide to visit a friend or take a stroll through the markets of Rome. Her every movement was a matter of state security and public relations. Her journeys were carefully managed public processions, her social calendar dictated by political necessity. Her friendships were not her own to choose. The circle of people she was allowed to associate with was carefully curated by the emperor and his most trusted advisors. To be known as a friend of the empress was to have a direct line to the ear of power, a position that many ambitious Romans would kill for. This meant that every potential friend was also a potential political liability. This control over her social life led to a profound and inescapable sense of isolation. True friendship, built on trust and mutual affection, became a dangerous luxury. How could an empress ever know if someone valued her for herself or for her influence? Any confidant could be seen by the emperor as a potential conspirator, someone trying to manipulate his wife to advance their own agenda. As a result, many empresses were surrounded by people, yet fundamentally alone. They lived in the busiest place on earth, the center of an empire of millions, but were often cut off from any genuine, unguarded human connection. The loneliness of the throne was not just a reality for the emperor. It was a daily burden for his wife as well. Into this vacuum of true friendship stepped the household staff. The empress's daily life was managed by a vast army of servants, slaves, and freed persons. These were her ladies-in-waiting, her dressers, her secretaries, and her bodyguards. They were her constant companions from the moment she woke until the moment she slept. They were the only people who saw her in her private moments, when the public performance of being an empress could be set aside. These relationships, more than any others, could define the empress's personal world. They could be her greatest comfort or her most terrifying threat. In the best of circumstances, a trusted servant could become a true confidant and a loyal ally. A lady-in-waiting or a personal freedwoman who had been with the empress for years might be the only person she could speak to honestly without fear of political repercussion. These loyal attendants could act as her eyes and ears in the wider court, gathering information and offering advice. The noblewoman Antonia Minor, for example, had a freedwoman named Antonia Trifana who was so loyal and important to her that she was honored with a public statue after her death. In the isolating world of the palace, such a bond of trust was a lifeline, a small island of security in an ocean of intrigue. But for every loyal servant, there was the potential for a spy. These same attendants who served the empress her meals and managed her affairs were perfectly positioned to betray her. A disgruntled slave or an ambitious freedman could be easily bribed or pressured by the empress's rivals. They could report on her private conversations, her moods, and her secret frustrations. They could twist her words, turning an innocent complaint into a sign of conspiracy. We saw this with Messalina, whose power was secured with the help of the freedman Narcissus, the same man who later orchestrated her downfall to save himself. An empress could never be entirely sure who was listening. Every whispered secret, every sigh of frustration, could be a weapon that would one day be used against her. This was the suffocating reality of the gilded prison. It was a life without privacy, where every relationship was fraught with political meaning. It was a life of profound isolation, surrounded by servants who could be either friends or spies. It was a life of constant performance, of upholding an impossible ideal of womanhood while navigating a treacherous world of hidden power. The empress was not just a person. She was an institution, and the weight of that institution could be crushing. The daily, grinding pressure of this existence was a peril, just as real as any assassin's dagger or poisoned cup. This was the life of the Roman empress, a paradox of immense power and profound vulnerability. A life of constant peril, from the biological pressure to produce an heir, to the threat of assassination from rivals, to the daily scrutiny of a life lived in a gilded prison. But was this brutal reality universal? Amidst the poison, the plots, and the political prisons, were there ever moments of genuine connection? Were there relationships that defied the cold logic of the state? In our final, concluding part, we explore the rare exceptions to the rule, the imperial marriages that seemed to be built not on power, but on partnership and love. And we consider the lasting legacy of these extraordinary women. Our journey so far has been a tour of the darkest rooms in the imperial palace. We have witnessed the slow poison of ambition, the explosive force of scandal, and the suffocating pressure of a life lived under constant watch. The system of Roman political marriage was, by its nature, a brutal and dehumanizing one. But history is never so simple. The systems that people build are one thing. The lives they live within them are another. Human nature is resilient. It can find ways to grow, even in the most barren soil. So we must ask, was there no room for love? Were there no exceptions to the rule of cold, hard pragmatism? In this final, concluding part, we will search for these glimmers of affection. Beginning with the story of an emperor and his empress that stands as a powerful testament to a different kind of union. Our story now turns to the 2nd century, often considered the golden age of the Roman Empire. The ruler on the throne is Marcus Aurelius, a man known to history not just as an emperor, but as a great Stoic philosopher. His private journal, known as the Meditations, reveals a mind devoted to duty, self-restraint, and the search for inner peace. He was a man who seemed destined to be a scholar, but who was called by fate to be the most powerful man in the world. His wife was Faustina the Younger, the daughter of the previous emperor, Antoninus Pius. Their marriage was, at its outset, a classic political arrangement, designed to ensure a smooth transition of power and continue the stable dynasty that had brought such prosperity to Rome. But their relationship would become something far more than a simple political contract. The first sign that their marriage was different was its sheer endurance. Marcus and Faustina were married for 30 years, a remarkable length of time in the turbulent world of the Roman elite, where divorce was common and life itself could be short. Throughout those 3 decades, they were constant companions. Faustina frequently traveled with her husband on his long and difficult military campaigns, a rare choice for an empress. Together, they shared the burdens of rule and the private joys and sorrows of a family. They had at least 13 children, a staggering number. But their life was also marked by profound grief, as the vast majority of their children died in infancy or early childhood. Sharing this repeated, devastating loss must have forged a bond between them that was deeper and more powerful than any political alliance. We are not left to simply guess at the nature of their feelings. We have a rare and precious window into the heart of an emperor. In his Meditations, in a section where he gives thanks for the blessings of his life, Marcus Aurelius writes a simple, quiet tribute to his wife. He thanks the gods for giving him, and I quote, "a wife so obedient, so affectionate, and so simple." These were not words written for public consumption. They were his private thoughts, a personal inventory of gratitude jotted down in the military camp far from Rome. It is this context that gives them such power and sincerity. He does not praise her for her illustrious ancestry or her role as the mother of his heirs. He praises her for her character, for her affection, for the gentle and uncomplicated nature of their personal relationship. This quiet sentence speaks volumes. It is a moment of pure human warmth that cuts through the cold marble of official history. After all the stories of ambition and betrayal, of marriages made and broken for political gain, here is an emperor simply expressing his love for his wife. He saw her not as a pawn or a political asset, but as a partner, a source of comfort and affection in a life filled with immense pressure and responsibility. His gratitude is not for what she did for the state, but for who she was to him. It is perhaps the most convincing piece of evidence we have that a genuine, loving relationship was possible at the very highest level of Roman society. Of course, no imperial story is without its shadows. A later source, the notoriously unreliable Historia Augusta, paints a very different picture of Faustina. It is filled with salacious rumors claiming that she was wildly unfaithful and had secret affairs with sailors and gladiators. It even suggests that their villainous son, the future Emperor Commodus, was actually the child of a gladiator with whom Faustina had been infatuated. These stories have defined her popular image for centuries, casting her as a promiscuous and deceitful woman the opposite of the simple wife Marcus described. It is the classic tale of a virtuous philosopher being betrayed by his immoral wife. But the evidence for these rumors is thin, and the actions of Marcus Aurelius himself tell a much different story. Throughout their long marriage, he never showed any public sign of suspicion or disapproval. He consistently honored her, trusted her, and promoted her status. When she accompanied him on campaign among the legions, he gave her the unprecedented title of Mater Castrorum, the mother of the camps, a title of immense respect that celebrated her as a loyal partner in his military duties. If he believed the rumors, he gave no indication. His support for her was unwavering. His actions suggest that he either dismissed the gossip as baseless slander, or that he had chosen to love and trust his wife unconditionally, regardless of any flaws she may have had. The final, most powerful testament to his feelings came when Faustina died. In the year 175 AD, while with him on campaign in the mountains of Cappadocia, she fell ill and passed away. The emperor's grief was profound. He wrote a moving tribute to her and delivered her funeral oration in Rome. He successfully petitioned the Senate to have her deified, making her a goddess to be worshipped. Her image was placed in the temple of Venus and Rama, and statues of her were erected throughout the empire. Most touchingly, he created one of the world's first major charities in her name, the Pile Faustinianae, or Girls of Faustina, an endowment that provided food and education for orphaned girls. These are not the actions of a man who felt wronged or betrayed. They are the actions of a devoted husband mourning a beloved wife. The story of Marcus and Faustina, then, stands as a powerful counterpoint to the tragedies we have explored. It suggests that despite the immense pressures of the imperial system, a relationship built on genuine love, affection, and mutual respect could not only exist, but thrive. It is a reminder that history is made not just by systems, but by people with all their capacity for connection and devotion. Their 30-year union was a rare and warm light in what was often a dark and cynical world. The love between Marcus and Faustina stands as a warm light in a dark history. But affection was not the only alternative to brutality. Another kind of successful union was possible, one built not on passion, but on a shared sense of duty and a partnership in power. This was a marriage based on mutual respect, intellectual harmony, and a collaborative approach to the immense task of ruling an empire. For this, we turn back to the story of the Emperor Trajan and his remarkable wife, Plotina. The love between a philosopher and his empress provides a comforting warmth, a sense that even in the most ruthless of systems, genuine human affection can prevail. But this was not the only path to a successful imperial marriage. There was another model, one based not on romance or passion, but on a foundation of profound and steady partnership. This was a union built on shared principles, mutual respect, and a collaborative approach to the heavy burden of rule. This relationship was less a love story and more a working alliance of two great minds dedicated to a common purpose. The greatest example of this model comes from the reign of Trajan and his quiet, dignified, and brilliant wife, the Empress Plotina. Pompeia Plotina entered the pages of history at the side of her husband, Trajan, when he became emperor in the core in the year 98 AD. She was a woman known for her interest in philosophy, her sharp intellect, and her dignified character. Her first public act as empress set the tone for her entire reign. As she ascended the steps of the imperial palace for the first time, she turned to the crowd gathered below. Instead of offering a distant wave, she made a simple, powerful declaration. She said, "I enter here such a woman as I hope to be when I leave." This was a promise. She was telling the Roman people that the immense power she was about to receive would not corrupt her. She would not become arrogant, cruel, or extravagant. It was a quiet, revolutionary statement, a direct rejection of the scandalous legacies of empresses like Messalina. Her promise established a new standard for the role of the emperor's wife. Plotina and Trajan shared a deep commitment to the principles of Stoicism and Epicureanism, philosophies that emphasized duty, moderation, and tranquility. Their court was not known for lavish decadence, but for its sense of order and purpose. Plotina was her husband's closest and most trusted advisor, a true partner in the project of governing the empire. The historian Cassius Dio, writing a century later, credited her with being a significant positive influence on the emperor. He wrote that she encouraged Trajan to be more just and humane, to lower taxes, and to listen to the petitions of ordinary people. Her influence was not seen as a threat, but as a vital part of the stable and effective administration that made Trajan's reign so successful. This was not the hidden, manipulative influence of Livia, nor the reckless self-interest of Messalina. Plotina's power was based on her reputation for wisdom and integrity. She was seen as a moral compass for the court, a steady hand that helped guide the state. Trajan clearly valued her as an equal partner, and he made sure the rest of the empire knew it. He granted her the prestigious title of Augusta, a formal recognition of her status. More importantly, her portrait was placed on Roman coins, sometimes even appearing on the reverse side of coins bearing his own image. This was a powerful symbol, a message sent to every corner of the empire that the stability and prosperity of the age was the work of two people, a husband and wife ruling in respectful collaboration. Nowhere was her role as a partner more crucial than at the very end of Trajan's life. As we have seen, the moment of an emperor's death was the moment of greatest danger for the empire. Trajan's long reign had been stable, but he had failed to officially adopt an heir. His clear preference was for the brilliant general Hadrian, but the formal steps had not been taken. When Trajan died suddenly on campaign, a disastrous power vacuum was created, one that could have easily ignited a civil war between his ambitious generals. It was in this moment of supreme crisis that Plotina performed her final and most important act as Trajan's partner, ensuring that his legacy of peace would not die with him. Her actions at her husband's deathbed have become the stuff of legend. She was the only one with him when he died. Understanding the chaos that would ensue if the news got out, she made a bold and calculated decision. According to the most dramatic version of the story, she concealed his death from everyone. She then sent letters to the Senate, written in her husband's name, officially adopting Hadrian as his son and heir. Some accounts even suggest she had an impersonator mimic the dying emperor's voice to make the orders seem legitimate. By the time she finally announced Trajan's passing, a successor was already legally in place. The crisis had been averted before it could even begin. Whether she truly forged the documents or simply managed to persuade her dying husband to sign them at the last possible moment is a debate for historians. But in either case, her actions were decisive. She recognized the imminent danger to the state and used her unique position to prevent it. This was not an act of personal ambition. She gained no more power for herself. Instead, it was an act of ultimate loyalty to her husband and his life's work. She knew that a peaceful succession was the final, critical piece of his legacy. As his partner, she took it upon herself to see that project through to its completion, ensuring that the stability she had helped him build would continue long. After he was gone, the partnership of Trajan and Plotina represents a different kind of imperial success story. It was a union founded on shared values, intellectual respect, and a common dedication to the duties of governance. Plotina demonstrated that an empress did not have to be a victim, a schemer, or a scandal. She could be a respected and influential force for good, earning her power not through fear or seduction, but through wisdom, humility, and unwavering competence. She was the quiet architect of an era's stability, a true partner in power who helped guide the Roman Empire through one of its most peaceful and prosperous periods. From the poison of Livia to the partnership of Plotina, the role of the Romau. Empress was never one thing. It was a mirror that reflected the ambitions and anxieties of the empire itself. It could be a story of ruthless ambition, of shocking scandal, of quiet desperation, or of enduring love and respect. The women who held this title were victims of a brutal system, but they were also formidable players who shaped the course of history, for good and for ill. As our story ends, we are left to consider their final, enduring legacy, the echoes they have left in the silent marble halls of history. The story of the Roman Empress is not a single narrative, but a vast and varied tapestry, woven with threads of triumph and tragedy, loyalty and betrayal. The women who wore this title were not a monolith. They were individuals, each reacting differently to the extraordinary pressures of their position. From the quiet, calculated cunning of Livia, patiently clearing a path for her son over decades, to the brazen, self-destructive scandal of Messalina, who gambled everything for passion and lost. From the ferocious ambition of Agrippina, who murdered a husband to crown her son and was in turn murdered by him, to the enduring, gentle love of Faustina, who provided a calm harbor for a philosopher king. Their lives show us that there was no one way to be an empress. There was only the gilded cage and the unique story of how each woman chose to live within it. They were, in many ways, victims of a patriarchal system that saw them as little more than political tools. Their marriages were strategic alliances, their bodies were vessels for producing heirs, and their freedom was sacrificed for the stability of the state. They were pawns in a game played by powerful men, moved around the board to secure a truce, reward a general, or merge a bloodline. They were disposed of without a thought when their political usefulness had expired, exiled to barren islands, or forced into miserable unions against their will. Their lives were a constant negotiation with the constraints placed upon them, a struggle for agency in a world designed to deny it to them. But they were never only victims. To remember them as such is to do a disservice to their intelligence, their resilience, and their formidable strength. These women were players in the great game, and many of them learned to play it with extraordinary skill. They wielded immense informal power, shaping the course of history from behind the throne. They advised emperors, managed succession plots, built powerful factions of loyalists, and ruthlessly eliminated their rivals. Whether through quiet influence like Plotina or open confrontation like Agrippina, they refused to be passive figures. They fought, they schemed, they survived, and they ruled, leaving their own indelible mark on the Roman world. The actions of these early empresses helped to shape and formalize the role for centuries to come. With each generation, the position of the empress became more public, more official, and more powerful. The empress was no longer just the emperor's wife. She was a public figure in her own right, with official titles, her own staff, and her image on the coinage of the realm. This evolution would reach its zenith centuries later in the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine Empire. There, empresses like the famous Theodora would rule not just as partners, but as near equals to their husbands, wielding direct and acknowledged political power. The long journey to that point began here, with these first women who dared to navigate the treacherous currents of the Roman court dot, and so we are left with their stories. Though separated from us by 2 millennia of history, they feel strangely familiar. They are timeless tales of the intoxicating nature of power and the terrible price it so often demands. They explore the eternal conflict between public duty and private desire, between personal happiness and the needs of the state. The gilded cage is not just an ancient Roman phenomenon. It is a metaphor that endures, reminding us that a life of immense privilege can also be a life of immense constraint. The stories of these empresses reveal a fundamental and unsettling truth, that to be bound to absolute power, whether by marriage or by birth, is to live in the most dangerous place on earth. And so, our journey through the palaces and perils of ancient Rome comes to a quiet close. The stories of these women, of their tragedies and their triumphs, have settled now into the silent halls of history. Their lives were a testament to the brutal truth that to be close to absolute power is the most dangerous place of all. As you settle into your rest, let these echoes of the past fade, leaving only peace. Thank you for listening.